This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Beginning today's show is Lee Schulz, Iowa State University livestock economist, with this week's cattle market update as he discusses the current market, export numbers, and a livestock slaughter summary for 2023. K-State Farming Systems Specialist Ignacio Ciampitti continues the show with sorghum planting reminders. He touches on seeding rate, planting date, planting depth, and row spacing. Drew Ricketts, K-State Wildlife Specialist, ends today's show by mentioning why people could start seeing bats in their living spaces and what to do and when to remove them. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Monday show with a cattle market update. And this week we're joined by Iowa State University livestock economist Lee Schulz. Lee, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me once again.
Lee, as we kick off our cattle market conversation, doing our usual rundown and starting with cash.
So if we look at the cash market this last week, it was fairly steady with the week prior. In Southern Plains, we traded really in that 184 range. Up here in the north, it was more that 186 to 187. I think when you look at the pressure that we've seen on the futures market, I think you have to point to the situation that's going on in the cash trade. We're seeing relatively large cattle weights. That's been noted a lot at various sources. When you look at USDA data, the weights are abnormally large for this time of year. The grading data shows large percentages of prime choice cattle. And really those larger supplies, at least kind of short term here, front loaded, have been a bit weighing on the marketplace. When I look at slaughter levels were up a bit from last week. Obviously, when you're comparing to year ago levels, those levels are lower. But what that's translated into is, and I think another reason we've seen pressure on the futures market, is that the box beef trade has been relatively disappointing. You're seeing box beef levels that were down the prior week. And really, we haven't seen that seasonal bump yet, or as large of a seasonal bump. So that's been a bit disappointing, and that's kind of filtered into what we've seen from a futures market and as well as a cash market trade. Another thing I think you have to blame a bit when you look at the feeder cattle market is corn was up this last week. So obviously that's provided a bit of pressure on feeder cattle supplies, even though those supplies remain relatively tight out there.
Are we still hoping to see a bit of a bump for grilling season as we enter into summer?
Certainly, that's, I think, the barometer that we're looking at as we look at wholesale trade, and how strong those levels can be pushed is really going to help provide an early signal of maybe how strong beef demand is, how strong we can push those levels as we get into the summer. Realizing we're seeing very robust, high retail prices. Obviously, consumers and their incomes have been pressured by inflationary pressures, and so that is the challenge as we get into the prime time for beef season here, of how high we can continue to push these prices onto consumers and still see them buy at the quantities that they've continued to buy at.
Transitioning now to talk about a few reports and articles that have come out, and this one related to monthly export numbers.
Important that anytime we get an update on some of the fundamentals as we talk about demand, I think it's important to maybe dig into the data a little bit. And USDA, they allow us to do that when we think about some of those monthly numbers. And I always like to use the U.S. Meat Export Federation summary of those monthly numbers, because it really provides a really good depiction of both the aggregate numbers, but we can then dig in a little bit by countries as well. Now, as we look at the March data, so realizing we're lagged a bit here, we did see that exports were down 10% for March 2024 compared to March 2023. But realizing March 2023 was a rather large month, so we're comparing to a high base year there. Now, when you look at value, though, it was only down slightly compared to a year ago. And why I think that's important to highlight here is, yes, we're expecting volumes to really tighten up when it comes to exports, but we are selling this product at higher prices, right? So that's helping offset some of that lower volume. So when you look at the total pie that's creating both quantity times price, it's not as big of a hit year over year, maybe as the volume numbers are really depicting there. I also like to highlight, this is what USMEF does in some of their discussion, is they calculate the export value per slaughter steer marketed. And when you look at what that March value was, it was $455 per head. So it really shows you the value of that export market that's contributing to the price and value of that steer being marketed. So, even at lower volumes, it still remains a really important key demand figure when we think about prices of fed cattle.
Lee, giving a bit of a closer breakdown and a little more timely, wanting to share on some weekly export numbers.
The weekly data, this is released on Thursday every week by the Foreign Ag Service of USDA, and this is a much more timely of data. So the latest data we have there is for the week ending May 2nd. So this data is only for volumes, though, so we don't get the value component of that. But a bit of the richness of this data is we get the accumulated exports, we get the outstanding sales, so that's product that's been sold. It's on the books, but it's not yet been shipped. And then we can get the total commitments of exports, in this case, beef. So as we look at accumulated exports, they're down 6% for roughly the first 4 months of the year compared to the first 4 months of 2023. The country that's been at least maybe bucking that trend is Mexico. So Mexico's up 14% year over year when we look at volumes from an accumulated export standpoint. Mexican peso has been rather strong relative to the U.S., or we've seen some strengthening there. So that's really helped exports to Mexico for beef. Otherwise, most other countries are down year over year, which is contributing to that overall 6% accumulated exports down. Now, as we look at the outstanding sales, that's even down further, so down 9%. And we see some rather large year over year declines. Mexico, Canada, and China are all down over 20% year over year. And so there is some of the pessimism as we look at exports going forward, is expectations that those exports will continue to see year over year declines. Now, that's not surprising given we're seeing tighter and tighter production. And I'll also remind you that, again, it's being sold at higher prices. And so that's mitigating some of that impact when we look at overall declining in exports. As we look at USDA, their forecast right now is about a 7% decline in beef exports for 2024 compared to 2023. 2025, they're expecting down double digits potentially.
And is that down double digits from 2024 or 2023?
Down from 2024, and that's important context to highlight. So that's a 2-year decline of, we're knocking on the door of over 15% decline from a 2-year perspective. So expectations that continued decline in exports, and it'll be exported at higher prices, but certainly that is a demand factor that we continue to watch.
And thinking about things from the USDA, they recently released a livestock slaughter summary for 2023.
So again, this is one of those where it is delayed a bit as we're talking about 2023 data, releasing it in 2024. This is a very detailed report that provides a lot of data on slaughter numbers. What I wanted to highlight for our listeners here in particular is you got to go to page 60. What they provide is a summary of federally inspected cattle slaughter plants and the number of heads slaughtered. But they also provide it by the size of the plant that's doing the slaughtering of those cattle. So it's various plant sizes all the way from 1 head per day. So those would be plants that do 1 to 999 head per year, all the way up to plants that do over 1 million head per year. And that's roughly about 5,000 head per day. What I want to note about the recent numbers when you look at them is when you look at 2022 compared to 2023 data, we've added 69 plants of that really small category. Now, if we think about what's been in the news a lot over the last couple of years, is really a lot of interest and investment, both privately and publicly, into small and medium-sized packing capacity. Well, this would be a case of it's the very, very small packing capacity, but it's the ones that can come online easiest. It's the least investment, the least infrastructure. And note that, that's a lot of small plants that we haven't seen for a long time that have added to the total cattle slaughter plant numbers out there. And when we look at the addition of these plants, note that this isn't adding to the total real capacity that we have. What it is adding to is the local economic activity driven by these plants operating as businesses on Main Street in these communities.
And Lee, wanting to take a quick look forward, the WASDE report was released this past Friday, and it contains the first forecast for 2025.
And I appreciate USDA always going out on a limb here and forecasting this far ahead. And, what I'll note for the beef balance sheet is expectation of continued decline, but large decline expected in beef production. So we look at their forecast, they're expecting production down 5.5%. Why I highlight that is I think this is the turning point in the cattle inventory cycle. So we're seeing the large declines due to more heifers likely being retained, that tightening up feeder cattle supplies, that tightening up fed cattle supplies, and that's showing really the bottom in beef production potentially in 2025 and potentially the height in what they're expecting for prices. So their annual price for steers, they're forecasting $188 as an annual price, maybe potentially a little bit higher some parts of the year, but on average, $188 would be roughly about $5 higher than what their annual price they're forecasting for 2024 is.
Lee, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having me once again.
That was Iowa State University livestock economist Lee Schulz. I will link the work that he referenced in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking about planting sorghum. And to talk about it, we're joined by K-State Farming Systems Specialist Ignacio Ciampitti. Ignacio, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Shelly, for your time.
Ignacio, as producers are thinking about planting sorghum, there are multiple things they want to probably take into consideration. And the first one for us to talk about today, seeding rate.
Yeah, and I think that sorghum farmers are looking at seeding rate. That's probably one of the big factors in terms of thinking about how they can tailor, the management recommendations of the crop. And we always talk about the variability and the range of seeding rates that they are available because sorghum plants can really compensate. We always talk about tillers and also the head size, the number of grains per head. And those are big factors that this plant has available to use as a way to compensate for potential lack of stands. So if we discuss on seeding rates, we usually say that the sorghum population, when we talk about population, sometimes we even talk about recommendations on final plants. We usually say that they might be depending on the conditions and depending on the regions with precipitation and yield potential, all the way from very dry conditions like very low populations, 20,000, and then some situations where we have, if you look at on wet environments, then we talk about the situations that we are looking at very high populations. And we are focusing on that, I would say, high-yielding environments, probably closer to 100 plus. And then that's a big difference, if you think about population. And then when the farmers need to start thinking about deciding what are the optimal seeding rates, one of the things that we always discuss is about targeting those optimal seeding rates based on the precipitation of the area, the conditions, And we have a really good information that it's very simple, just to provide some guidance on how to basically think about seeding rates in situations that you are in less than 20 inches of basically that seasonal precipitation. We are always talking about seeding rates that are probably closer to 30,000 seeds per acre. With populations, when we talk about final number of plants, we are thinking about final number of plants close to 25,000 plants. And then when you're thinking about precipitation, as we're moving to environments that we have better precipitation conditions, 20 to 26 inches and 26 inches to 30 and plus 30 inches. Those seeding rates, recommendations, they start going up. Like they go from 30 to 35, to try again to target probably around close to 30,000 plants. Then with 26 and 30 inches, we can push a little more populations, and we have around 50, 60,000 seeds per acre. And then again, our goal is to target around 40 or 45,000 plants per acre. And if we go to a very high-yielding situations, if we are lucky enough to really push sorghum into high-yielding environments, we will be seeing high populations. We're looking at sometimes, seeing rates first on 70, 80, 90, and then with our goal of getting these 80, 90,000 plants. And those are very unique. If you think about it, the main conditions, most of the farmers will going to be, I think that most of the farmers are going to be in between 50,000 seeing rate, and then some moving west. When we start looking at 40, 30, and then in some situations, even very low until 20,000 in terms of, seeing rate. Mainly because we need to recognize as we're moving west with less precipitation, we are also hoping for that tillering expression capacity, because the ability of compensating and the ability of sorghum to produce more heads via tillers is what basically will help us, to get some compensation on yield.
As growers are thinking about putting the sorghum seed into the field, does it really matter how wide that row spacing is?
Yeah, row spacing is still always a factor. We have done studies looking at difference between very narrow rows and all the way to basically 30-inch. And we are seeing that in some situations, if we think about why we are narrowing rows, the concept of narrowing rows is basically coming from the idea that we want to close that canopy, that sorghum field earlier in the season. And we want to make sure that we maximize the interception of light and convert that light into basically biomass and yield. And this helps, in many situations, farmers, because you can also take care of big problem in many situations, that is, weeds. And the weed control is one of the big issues for many, many farmers, right? So I think that this idea of using narrow rows and basically pushing that is another concept that is relevant, and it's a concept that in many situations is beneficial. So some of the data that we have in overall shows, a small, minor, modest benefits. We're talking about sometimes between 4 to 5 bushels for narrowing rows, compared to situations that we say that there are environments, that if you use wide row spacing in, I would say most of the times is even when we are looking at yields below 100 bushels or even less than that, we haven't seen big deals are connected to what we discussed before. Canopy closure, early season, hopefully better weed control, but most of the benefits of narrowing rows we have seen more when we are moving to these higher yielding environments. And I think that is something to keep in mind. We have sometimes situations of farmers asking us questions. There might be situations where narrow rows cannot be beneficial. Narrow rows has the only, I would say, complication that the number of final stand of plants needs to be put into more attention. In some situations, depending what equipment you use, we need to push for, 5-10% higher seeding rate that the 30-inch target. That's one. And the second one is like in cases where you might be in dry environments, you might think about the narrow rows, because narrow rows will push those plants to use water quickly, consume the water, and then when you get to the moment that the sorghum plants are going to need more, if you are in environments that you don't have too much rain, then that plant is going to potentially have conditions of drought and experience conditions of drought, because that basically narrow rows, early season, water basically competition. So those are the only environments where we might see potentially that narrow rows might not be as beneficial as in many other environments.
Does seeding rate and row spacing need to adjust depending on when growers get that seed into the ground?
Yes, I would say when we are thinking about, we usually say, and maybe just connected to the topic of optimum planting date, right? We have a very big summary of data on planting date, and then if you talk to different farmers, everyone has probably different strategies. And what we are thinking is, what is in overall this kind of that optimal planting date for sorghum? And then what we found in looking at most of our research is looking at that early June to be one of the potential optimal planting dates. Mainly because we tend to get maximum yield, not the maximum that we can get, because if you really want to push for very, very high yielding, we will use a different strategy. And we will do that probably in environments that we don't have any problem with water. Or if you really have someone testing this under irrigation. But in those rain-fed environments, I'm talking to many, I would say 99% of those sorghum farmers out there. So if you think about that optimal planting date, that early June seems to be kind of a sweet spot. We have maximum attainable yield, and we have also very low variability, meaning that we have seen that year over year, the variation in yield in those environments seems to be more stable. I mean, we get to see that we always get some really good yields. I mean, in fact, if we move into different sections early season, there might be years that you might get very high yields, there might be years that you get nothing. So, and that's one of the issues on that lack of stability. That's why that early June seems to be one of the best environments. And if you think about the combination of what you asked before on planting date with plant density and row spacing, I would say that if you are planting late, that is one of the scenarios where you start thinking about how do I adjust my seed rate? Because by planting late, and when we're talking late, I mean, if we put as a perspective early June, so we need to say that we're planting later than that. And then one of the challenges of late planting is we need to be worried about or careful about the flowering time to make sure that the plant will be able to finish, before the frost. And the second one is you need to remember that that plant will have less time, less number of days. And then what happens there is they have less ability to compensate. So they have less ability to produce tillers. So in those scenarios, we always say late planted sorghum, could benefit by narrowing rows because we want to close the canopy faster. And also by, increasing that seed rate, and leave it up to make sure that we get most of our grains and yield is going to come from heads. But only in many situations, plants that will produce only one head. So we need to then increase that seed rate to compensate for that potential lack of tillering that we're going to experience during the growing season, because that growing season is going to be very, very short.
Ignacio, as we round out today's conversation, talking about things growers should think about before planting sorghum and wanting to mention how deep that seed should be.
We always say that they use a rule of thinking about 1-2 inches seems to be the optimum. And then shallower or deeper planting depth, I would say only focus on that. If you are looking for placing the seed in good temperature and moisture conditions. But in many situations, that optimum sweet spot is between 1 or 2 inches.
Ignacio, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you so much, Shelley, for your invitation.
That was K-State Farming System Specialist Ignacio Ciampitti. I will link an Agronomy e-update article titled Sorghum Management Considerations, Planting Practices in today's show notes on agtoday.net if you'd like to read more on this topic. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Monday show talking about bats. And to talk about it, we're joined by K-State Wildlife Specialist Drew Ricketts. Drew, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me back.
Drew, you've been getting quite a few questions about bats, and why is that?
They've come out of hibernation. They're being a lot more active right now. People are also starting to detect signs that they might have bats living in a house. And those are the main sorts of calls that I get that have to do with bats. So, just like last time we talked about snakes, as things become more active, then folks start noticing them more.
And how might people want to get them out of their space?
So there's different ways of dealing with bats. If the bats are actually in the attic, they're living in the upper portion of the house, and they're not getting into the living space, then it's really hard to go in there and actually find all those bats and catch them effectively and try and take them back outside of the house. So that's not the way that we do it. The really efficient way to get bats out of a attic or a non-living space portion of a house is to find how they're getting in and out, and then we put up what they call a bat excluder. Sometimes they're also called bat valves, but these can be a homemade device that might be made out of sort of like onion sac type material that we staple really tightly around that entryway, and then it hangs down, and the bats can get out of it, but they can't figure out how to get back under that and get back in there. It might also be like a sheet sheet or some plastic sheeting or something like that. It can be something as advanced as if you were to type in a search on Google, you would find bat valves that are sort of cone-shaped that actually have sort of a valve in the end of them. But we're putting a one-way device up so that the bats can get out, but they can't get back in. We do have some protected species of bats all the way to endangered bats in Kansas, but a lot of the bats that live in structures are not protected species. And I think there's this misconception because most bat control companies or wildlife control companies won't do bat work from about May until August. There's a misconception that that's because they're protected. In most cases, it's not. It's actually because sometimes when we have bats living in attics, it's a maternal colony. And when we have those maternal colonies, we've got the adult bats, and then we also have the pups. And from the time they're born, sometime in late April or early May, through about August, we have those pups that can't fly up there, and they're dependent on their mother. And if we put up one of those bat excluders, if we allow the females to leave but not get back in, then we've got those pups up there that are going to starve to death. And as that starts to happen, then they oftentimes will go from the attic into the living space, and we end up with a whole bunch of bat pups in the house, which is not a good scenario. The other thing that can happen is those bat pups will just die up in the attic, and that creates, odor issues. It's also a sanitary issue. So when we do have a maternal colony in an attic from May to August, as long as they're not getting into the living space of the house, really the best thing to do is to wait until August and then put those bat excluders up so that they can fly out.
As we are talking about bats, also wanting to just put a reminder out there about the concern they do bring with rabies.
Bats are a species that can carry rabies, and on top of that, they've got really small mouths, and it's very easy for a bat to bite you and you not know it if they have been on you. And so if we have a bat in a living space, there is very good advice out there about how to get those caught and get them moved. But if there's ever somebody in a room with a bat that cannot answer the question 100%, I know that that bat has not been on me, then it's important to collect that bat if possible and submit it for rabies testing. If we can't submit that bat for rabies testing, then that person needs to get into contact with their county health department, because post-exposure rabies treatment is going to be an important thing to consider in those situations.
That was K-State Wildlife Specialist Drew Ricketts. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.